On a Saturday morning in September 1976, a rusted flatbed truck pulled onto the gravel drive of the Hadfield farm in McLean County, Illinois, hauling the sorriest-looking piece of machinery anyone in the county had seen in years. It was a 1959 Massey Ferguson 72 combine. 17 years old, faded red paint peeling off in sheets, header bent slightly to the left, reel missing 3 tines, and a crack in the grain tank that someone had patched with what looked like barn roofing tin. The truck stopped in front of the machine shed. Behind the wheel was a 19-year-old kid named Jesse Hadfield. Thin, sunburned, quiet in the way that people mistook for stupid. He climbed out of the cab and stood there looking at the 320 acres of corn stretching flat and gold to the horizon in every direction. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse, watching without expression, was his grandfather, Ed Hadfield, 68 years old, 6'2", even with the stoop that came from 50 years of bending over equipment. Ed wore clean overalls, a seed company cap, and the kind of face that hadn't smiled since 1974, the year his only son, Jesse's father, had died. Ed looked at the combine on the flatbed. Then he looked at his grandson. Then he looked at the combine again. "What," Ed said slowly, "is that?" "It's a Massey Ferguson 72, sir. 1959 model. I bought it at the Hendricks auction in Peoria last week." "I can see what it is. I'm asking you why it's on my property." Jesse wiped his hands on his jeans. "Because I'm here to farm, Grandpa. Like Dad wanted." The silence that followed lasted long enough for a crow to land on the fence post by the drive, look at both of them, and fly away again. Now let me stop here and explain something, because what happened next on that gravel driveway doesn't make any sense unless you understand what had happened to the Hadfield family in the 2 years before Jesse showed up with that broken-down combine. Ed Hadfield had been farming since 1932, started as a boy on his father's 160 acres during the Depression, took over in 1945 when his father died, and spent the next 3 decades building the operation into 320 acres of some of the best corn and soybean ground in central Illinois. By the early 1970s, Ed was one of the most respected farmers in the county. Not the biggest. There were operations twice his size. But nobody questioned Ed Hadfield's judgment. He'd survived the Depression through his father's stories, survived the war years, survived every drought and price crash and equipment failure that 50 years of farming could throw at a man. Ed had one son, Richard, born in 1940, and Richard Hadfield was everything Ed wasn't: loud, ambitious, impatient. Where Ed saw risk, Richard saw opportunity. Where Ed said wait, Richard said now. They argued about farming the way fathers and sons have argued about farming since the first seed went into the first furrow. In 1971, Richard convinced Ed to co-sign a loan for a brand-new John Deere 4320 tractor. Cost was around $12,000, a significant investment for their operation. Ed didn't want to do it. The old Farmall 560 they'd been running was paid for and still working, but Richard was 22, full of energy, and Ed was tired of fighting. The tractor arrived. Richard loved it. And for 2 years things went well. The early 1970s were boom times. Corn prices shot up after the Soviet grain deal in 1972, exports were soaring, and suddenly every farmer in the Midwest felt rich. Richard wanted to expand, buy more land, finance more equipment, go big. Ed said no. One financed tractor was enough risk. They fought about it constantly. At the dinner table, in the barn, at the feed store counter where half the county could hear them. Ed's position never changed. Debt was danger. Richard's position never changed either. The old man was holding them back. In March 1974, Richard Hadfield was driving the 4320 on County Road 9 when a tire blew at speed. The tractor rolled into a drainage ditch. Richard was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. Ed Hadfield buried his only son on a Thursday. By Friday, he had stopped talking to almost everyone. He paid off the loan on the 4320 within 6 months, sold livestock, emptied savings, worked himself half to death to get that debt cleared. Then he parked the John Deere in the back of the machine shed, covered it with a tarp, and never started it again. For 2 years after Richard's death, Ed farmed alone. Neighbors offered help. Ed declined. The county extension agent suggested he lease out some acreage. Ed said nothing. His wife, Mabel, tried to convince him to slow down. Ed kept working. And then, on that September morning in 1976, his dead son's boy showed up with a rusted combine and a claim on 320 acres. "Your father," Ed said carefully, still standing on the porch, "didn't want you farming." That wasn't true, and both of them knew it. Richard had talked about nothing else. He'd written letters to Jesse, who'd been living with his mother in Champaign since the divorce in 1970, describing the farm, the equipment, the land, the future he was building. Jesse had kept every letter. They were in a shoebox in the cab of his truck right now. "Dad wanted me to farm this land," Jesse said. "You know he did. Your father is dead, and this farm isn't yours." "Not yet." Ed's jaw tightened. He came down the porch steps slowly, walked across the yard to the flatbed, and looked at the combine up close. He touched the cracked grain tank, the bent header, the missing tines. He looked at the engine, a Perkins diesel that hadn't been properly maintained in years, judging by the oil residue on the block. "How much did you pay for this?" $420. "You got robbed." "I don't think so. Son, this machine is junk. It's older than you are. The header's bent, the tank's cracked, and I'd bet money the cylinder's scored. You couldn't harvest a garden with this thing, let alone 320 acres of field corn." Jesse didn't flinch. "I can fix it." "With what? You're 19. You don't have tools. You don't have parts. You don't have experience. And you don't have permission to be on my land." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. If you were Jesse, 19 years old, standing in front of a man who clearly didn't want you there, with nothing but a broken combine and a dead father's dream, what would you do? Would you leave? Would you argue? Would you beg? Think about that for a moment. Think about what it takes to stand your ground when the person you're standing against is the only family you have left. Jesse reached into his truck and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Richard Hadfield to his son, dated January 9th, 2 months before the accident. Jesse held it out. Ed didn't take it. "Read it," Jesse said. "Please." Ed stared at the envelope for a long time. Then he took it, pulled out the letter, and read it standing in the gravel driveway with the September wind pushing at the corn behind him. What the letter said, I'll tell you later. Because what matters right now is what Ed did after he read it. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, handed it to Jesse, and then he said 5 words that changed everything. "1 season. Prove it works." The terms were simple and brutal. Jesse had until the end of harvest, roughly 6 weeks, to bring in the corn crop on all 320 acres, using nothing but his own equipment and his own labor. No help from Ed. No borrowing Ed's machinery, no hiring custom harvesters. If Jesse could do it, bring in the full crop before the first hard freeze, with acceptable loss rates, Ed would deed over 160 acres to Jesse outright, half the farm. But if Jesse failed, if the combine broke down permanently, if he couldn't finish in time, if the loss rate was above what Ed considered acceptable, Jesse would leave. No arguments, no second chances. Gone. "And one more thing," Ed said. "You don't touch the John Deere in the shed. That tractor doesn't move." Jesse agreed. He didn't have a choice. What Ed didn't tell Jesse, what Ed didn't tell anyone, was that there was a sealed envelope in the top drawer of his desk in the farmhouse. It had been there since April 1974, 1 month after Richard's death. Written in Ed's careful hand on the outside were the words, "To be opened upon my death or when the boy comes home, whichever happens first." Jesse had just come home, but Ed didn't open the envelope. Not yet. He wanted to see something first. Let me break down the numbers, because this is where the story turns. In September 1976, Jesse Hadfield was facing the following situation. 320 acres of field corn, most of it dented and drying but not yet ready for harvest. Average yield in McLean County that year was running about 110 bushels per acre. That meant roughly 35,200 bushels of corn to harvest. A properly functioning combine in 1976 could harvest maybe 15 to 20 acres a day in good conditions. Jesse's Massey Ferguson 72, even if he got it running perfectly, was a smaller, older machine. Realistically, maybe 10 to 12 acres a day. At that pace, 320 acres would take roughly 27 to 32 working days. He had about 40 days before the typical first hard freeze in central Illinois, which hit around late October or early November. On paper, it was possible. Barely. But that calculation assumed the combine ran every single day without breakdown. And anyone who's ever operated a machine that old knows that assumption is fantasy. Jesse had the combine unloaded by noon that first day. He spent the rest of Saturday and all of Sunday underneath it. His tools were basic: a socket set, wrenches, a ball-peen hammer, vice grips, baling wire, and a welding kit he'd bought at auction for $35. The header was bent at the left end. Jesse jacked it up, heated the frame with a torch, and used a come-along to pull it straight. 4 hours. Not factory perfect, but within an inch of level. The cracked grain tank he patched with proper welded steel plate. The missing reel tines he fabricated from steel rod stock. Monday he tackled the engine, pulled the injectors, cleaned them, bled the lines, replaced a cracked fuel filter. By Monday afternoon, the Perkins diesel was running. Rough, smoky, but running. Ed watched all of this from the farmhouse window. He said nothing. On Tuesday, September 14th, 1976, Jesse Hadfield made his first pass through the Hadfield cornfield. The combine chattered and groaned and shook like it was trying to tear itself apart. The header grabbed the corn stalks unevenly. The threshing cylinder made a sound that Jesse didn't like, a metallic ringing that suggested something was loose inside. But corn was going into the tank. Not cleanly, not efficiently, but it was going in. He made it through 3 acres that first day before a belt snapped. He shut down, walked to the machine shed, Ed's machine shed, technically, and found a replacement belt in the parts bins along the wall. Ed had parts for everything in that shed, organized by size and type in coffee cans and cigar boxes on wooden shelves that went back to the 19th. Jesse replaced the belt by flashlight, went to bed in the cab of his truck at 11 that night. Wednesday, he got through 7 acres. Thursday, 9. By Friday, he'd figured out the machine's rhythm, when to push, when to back off, how to angle into the rows to compensate for the header's slight remaining bend. He was averaging 10 acres a day, right at the bottom of his calculation. But here's the thing about old machines. They don't break once. They break constantly. Small things, a bearing here, a chain link there, a hydraulic line that weeps oil until it finally lets go at the worst possible moment. Jesse spent 2 to 3 hours every evening repairing whatever had gone wrong that day and preparing for whatever would go wrong tomorrow. At the end of the first week, he'd harvested 52 acres, roughly on pace, but just barely. No margin for error. Fast forward to the end of September. Jesse had been at it for 2.5 weeks. He'd completed 148 acres, slightly ahead of schedule because he'd gotten faster as he learned the machine's quirks. But the combine was deteriorating. The engine was burning more oil. The threshing cylinder bearings were getting louder. The hydraulic system was losing pressure, which meant the header was sluggish to raise and lower. And something else had changed. Ed Hadfield had started coming out of the house. Not to help, not to talk, just to watch. He'd stand by the machine shed in the early morning, coffee in hand, and watch Jesse head out to the field. One evening, Jesse came back to find a plate of fried chicken and mashed potatoes sitting on the tailgate of his truck, still warm. A note underneath in Ed's handwriting, 2 words, "Keep going." Jesse ate the chicken and cried, not because he was sad, because it was the first sign that his grandfather still had a heart beating somewhere under all that granite. Now I need to tell you what happened at the feed store, because that's where the story nearly ended. October 3rd, a Sunday. Jesse drove into town to pick up parts, a replacement hydraulic hose and 2 belts he'd ordered from the Napa dealer in Bloomington. While he was waiting, he walked across the street to Gunderson's Feed and Supply to get a cup of coffee. The feed store was the center of McLean County's farming community. Every important conversation in that county either started or ended at Gunderson's counter. And on that Sunday morning, 3 men were sitting on the bench by the front window. Dale Gunderson himself, Tom Pfeiffer, who farmed 600 acres north of town, and Carl Brandt, the John Deere dealer from Normal. Jesse walked in. The conversation stopped. "Morning," Jesse said. Dale nodded. "Jesse, how's the harvest going?" "Getting there." Carl Brandt leaned forward. Mid-50s, thick neck, gold watch. He sold more John Deere equipment in the county than anyone. "I heard you're trying to harvest Ed's 320 with that old Massey. That true?" "Yes, sir." Carl looked at Tom. Tom looked at Dale. All 3 of them had the same expression, the one adults get when they're trying not to laugh in front of a child. "Son," Carl said, "I've been selling farm equipment for 22 years. That combine you're running is older than my daughter. You're going to burn it out before you finish, and Ed will have lost a season's crop. The machine is holding up fine, for now. 1 week of October rain, and you're done. Your corn will be standing in the field rotting while you wait for parts that Massey Ferguson doesn't even make anymore." Tom Pfeiffer chimed in. "I told Ed 6 months ago I'd custom harvest his ground for a fair price. He wouldn't even discuss it. Now he's letting a boy with a junk combine do the job. No offense, Jesse, but it doesn't make sense." Jesse put down his coffee. "It makes sense to me." "How?" "Explain to me how a 19-year-old kid with a $400 combine makes more sense than a professional operation with modern equipment." "Because it's my land, or it will be." Carl Brandt laughed. Not a mean laugh, more like the sound a man makes when he's genuinely confused by another man's stubbornness. "Come by the dealership Monday. I'll put you in a used 6600, good machine, 2 years old. I can finance you at 11.5% over 5 years. You'd finish the harvest in 2 weeks. Jesse looked at Carl Brandt for a long time. Then he said something that got repeated at every counter and diner booth in the county for the next decade. "Mr. Brandt, my father financed a John Deere tractor in It killed him 3 years later. I'm not financing anything. Not from you. Not from anyone. Not ever." He picked up his coffee, walked out, and drove back to the farm. Carl Brandt sat there with his mouth open. Dale Gunderson poured himself another cup and said quietly, "That boy sounds exactly like Ed did at that age." Nobody laughed after that. But Carl Brandt's warning about October weather wasn't wrong. On October 8th, the rain started. Not a gentle autumn drizzle, a cold, steady downpour that turned the fields to mud and the sky to iron. Jesse sat in his truck for 3 days watching the rain fall on unharvested corn, doing the math over and over. 172 acres done, 148 to go. If the rain stopped by the 11th and the fields dried for 2 days, he could start again on the 13th. That would give him roughly 20 days before the average first hard freeze. At 10 acres a day, 20 days, 148 acres needed. Almost exactly right. But almost exactly in farming means one breakdown away from failure. The rain stopped on October 10th. The fields needed 3 days to dry, not 2. Jesse started again on the 13th and the combine wouldn't start. The Perkins diesel cranked and cranked but wouldn't catch. The fuel system again. This time it was the injection pump, a complex mechanical component that Jesse couldn't fix with wrenches and baling wire. This was the crisis point, the moment where the bet either held or collapsed. Jesse called every parts dealer within 100 miles. A rebuilt injection pump for a 1959 Perkins 4.270 diesel was not a common item. Nobody had one. The nearest available pump was at a salvage yard in Terre Haute, Indiana, 3 hours each way, $350, which was most of the money Jesse had left. He drove to Terre Haute that afternoon, picked up the pump, and drove back through the night. By the headlights of his truck, in a temperature that had dropped to 38 degrees, he pulled the old pump and installed the new one. His hands were so cold he could barely hold the wrenches. The bolts were corroded. 2 of them snapped. He had to drill them out and re-tap the holes, working by flashlight at 2 in the morning. At 5:47 a.m. on October 15th, the engine fired. Rough, smoky, loud, but alive. Jesse was back in the field by 7. He harvested 14 acres that day, his best number yet. The fear of losing had burned away everything unnecessary. He moved through the corn rows with a precision that came not from experience but from desperation. What Jesse didn't know was that Ed Hadfield had driven to Terre Haute the day before, a different salvage yard, looking for the same part. Ed had found one too, paid $400 for it, and brought it home. It was sitting in the machine shed, on the workbench, wrapped in newspaper, just in case. Ed never told Jesse about that pump. He never had to. But the fact that he'd gone looking, that he'd spent $400 of his own money to make sure his grandson could keep going, tells you everything you need to know about what was happening inside that old man's chest. Let me jump ahead now, because the next 2 weeks were the same story repeated 18 times. Wake up before dawn, fix whatever broke overnight, harvest until dark, fix whatever broke during the day, sleep 4 hours, repeat. By October 25th, Jesse had 289 acres done, 31 to go. 11 days until the average first freeze. On paper, he was going to make it, but on October 27th, the threshing cylinder finally gave out. The bearings had been screaming for weeks, and now they seized completely. The cylinder locked up mid-row, and the sudden stop sheared 2 drive belts and cracked a mounting bracket. Jesse crawled under the combine, looked at the damage, and felt something break inside his chest that wasn't mechanical. 27 acres to go. Parts he didn't have. Time he was running out of. Money he'd already spent. He sat in the dirt under the combine for a long time. The afternoon sun was dropping. The corn rustled. A meadowlark sang somewhere to the east. Jesse put his head in his hands. That's when he heard the footsteps. Ed Hadfield walked across the stubble field carrying a steel toolbox in one hand and a coffee can full of bearings in the other. He set both down next to the combine without a word. Jesse looked up. "Grandpa." "Wait a Borkamabaram's father. Donors the Poisel the father. Commercial Dave Purist Tickletaus." "Shut up and hand me the 3/4 socket." They worked together until midnight. Ed knew that combine, not the specific machine, but its type. He'd worked on Massey Ferguson's in the 1960s, back before he switched to the Farmall line. His hands remembered things his mouth never talked about. Together, they pulled the cylinder, pressed out the ruined bearings, pressed in new ones from Ed's coffee can collection, remounted the cylinder, replaced the belts with spares from the machine shed, and welded the cracked bracket. They didn't talk while they worked. Not about the bet, not about Richard, not about the sealed envelope in Ed's desk. The only words were mechanical. "Hold this, turn that, hand me the half-inch." At 10 minutes past midnight, Ed straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at his grandson. "Cylinder should hold. Bearings are good, new old stock from the co-op. Been in that coffee can since better than what was in there. Thank you." Ed nodded. Then, for the first time in 2 years, Jesse saw something change in the old man's face. Not a smile. Something deeper than a smile. Recognition. "Your father," Ed said quietly, "would have asked for help on day 1. That's not a compliment, and it's not a criticism. It's just a fact. Richard always wanted someone else to make things easier. You don't. I see that now." He picked up his toolbox and walked back toward the house. "Now I need to tell you about the envelope, because the harvest isn't really the story. The harvest is just how the story became visible. The sealed envelope had been in Ed's desk drawer since April 9th. Ed had written it 1 month after Richard's accident, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning while Mabel slept. He'd written it in one draft, sealed it, and never looked at it again. Here is what it said, and I know what it said because Jesse read it out loud at Ed's funeral in 1989, and 3 people who were there gave me the same account, word for word. To whoever opens this, I made a mistake. I didn't teach my son right. I taught him what not to do. Don't borrow, don't expand, don't take risks. But I never taught him why. I never showed him what it looks like to build something with your hands from nothing. I just said no, over and over. No. And he went and did the opposite, because that's what sons do when their fathers only know how to say no. If the boy comes to this farm, Richard's boy, don't make the same mistake I made. Don't just tell him no. Show him why. Let him work. Let him struggle. Let him earn it. And if he earns it, give him the whole thing. Not half. All of it. He'll understand what his father never got the chance to learn. Ed Hadfield, April 16th. Ed had written, give him the whole thing. All 320 acres. The bet, the one-season challenge, the deal about 160 acres. Ed had always intended to give Jesse everything. The bet was never about whether Jesse could harvest 320 acres with a junk combine. The bet was about whether Jesse had the character to try. But there's something else in this story that nobody talks about. Something that explains why Ed was so hard, why he'd spent 2 years refusing to acknowledge his grandson, why the first thing he said to Jesse was, "This farm isn't yours." Ed Hadfield was afraid. Not of losing the farm. Not of Jesse failing. Ed was afraid that Jesse would succeed and then die the same way Richard did. On a tractor, on a county road, on a farm that had already taken his son. Ed wasn't pushing Jesse away because he didn't love him. Ed was pushing Jesse away because he loved him too much to bury another Hadfield. The sealed envelope was a confession. It was Ed admitting to himself in the middle of the night that his fear was destroying the thing he was trying to protect. Jesse finished the harvest on November 2nd, 320 acres, 35,000 bushels of corn, give or take. Loss rates higher than a modern combine, but within acceptable range for the era. Every kernel harvested by a 19-year-old kid and a 17-year-old machine. Ed was standing by the grain elevator when Jesse brought the last load in. The sun was going down. The temperature was 34 degrees. The first hard freeze would come that night. Jesse had made it by less than 24 hours. Jesse climbed down from the combine. He was thinner than he'd been in September. His hands were cut and burned and calloused. His jeans were held together with duct tape at one knee. He looked 10 years older than 19. Ed walked over to him. They stood face to face in the orange light. "You did it," Ed said. "Yes, sir. Your combine's shot. Cylinder won't last another season. Headers bent worse than when you started. Engines burning a quart of oil every 3 hours. I know. We'll rebuild it this winter. Together. I've got parts." Jesse blinked. "We?" Ed reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope. It was yellowed now, the edges soft with age. He held it out. "This is from 2 years ago. I should have given it to you the day you arrived. I wasn't ready." Jesse opened it, read it again. He looked up at his grandfather with wet eyes. "All 320. Every acre. Your father would have gotten it eventually, too. I was just too stubborn and too scared to say so while he was alive. That's my failure. Not his. Mine." Jesse tried to say something. Couldn't. Ed put his hand on the boy's shoulder, the first time he'd touched his grandson since Richard's funeral. "You did something I never thought you could do, and you did it the right way. No debt, no shortcuts. No asking for help until the machine was physically broken beyond one man's ability to fix. That's not your father's way. That's not my way either, if I'm honest. That's something new, something better." They stood there while the sun finished going down. The combine sat in the yard behind them, battered, exhausted, held together with welds and wire and stubbornness. It looked like junk. It had just harvested 320 acres. Now let me finish this, because the harvest of 1976 was just the beginning. Jesse farmed those 320 acres for the next 12 years. He never bought a new combine. He rebuilt the Massey Ferguson 72 that winter, with Ed's help, new cylinder, new bearings throughout, repainted, header straightened properly this time. The machine ran until 1984, when Jesse finally replaced it with a used Massey Ferguson 510. He bought at a retirement auction for $8,500 cash. He never financed a single piece of equipment. Not once, not ever. He followed the rule that Ed had followed and that Ed's father had followed before him. Pay cash or don't buy. The JD dealer in Normal, Carl Brandt, came by twice a year with financing offers. Jesse declined every time. Eventually, Carl stopped coming. The 1980s farm crisis hit McLean County hard. Interest rates climbed into the mid-teens. Corn prices fell below the cost of production. Land values dropped by 40%. Farmers who had expanded on credit, who had followed the advice of dealers and banks and extension agents to get bigger, borrow more, modernize faster, watched their equity evaporate. Between 1982 and 1986, 11 farms within 10 miles of the Hadfield place went to auction. 11 families who had been on their land for generations, forced out by debt they'd taken on during the boom years. Jesse went to some of those auctions. He stood in the back and watched men he'd known his whole life sell their equipment, their livestock, their land. He watched Carl Brandt buy repossessed tractors for pennies on the dollar and resell them to the next round of optimists. Jesse never came close to losing his farm. His operating costs were so low, paid for equipment, no land payments, minimal overhead, that he could survive corn at $2 a bushel when his neighbors needed $3.50 just to break even. Ed Hadfield died in March 81 years old. Went to sleep in his chair by the window overlooking the south field and didn't wake up. Mabel found him in the morning with his reading glasses still on and the Prairie Farmer magazine open in his lap to an article about no-till planting. The funeral was at the Methodist church in town. Packed, standing room only. Half the county came, not because Ed Hadfield had been friendly, because he hadn't been. They came because he'd been right. For 50 years, Ed had said the same thing. Stay small, stay paid for, stay alive. And in 1989, after the worst decade in American farming since the Depression, his farm was still standing. His grandson was still farming. The land was still in the family. Jesse read the letter at the funeral. The sealed envelope. Every word. When he got to the part where Ed wrote, "Don't just tell him no, show him why," half the church was crying. After the service, at the reception in the church basement, ham sandwiches, potato salad, Jell-O molds, the food that Midwestern grief has always tasted like, Carl Brandt came up to Jesse. Carl was 62 now, thinner. The gold watch was gone, sold during the lean years. His dealership had survived the crisis, but barely. He'd lost customers, lost friends, lost whatever certainty he'd once had about the way the world worked. "Jesse, I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." "Yes, sir?" "That day in the feed store, when I told you your combine was junk and tried to sell you a 6600 on credit, I remember. I was wrong. Not about the combine, it was junk." A small smile. "But I was wrong about everything else. You and Ed did something I didn't think was possible. You proved that the old way still worked, that a man could farm without debt and survive. I spent 20 years telling farmers the opposite, and I watched half of them go under for believing me." Jesse looked at Carl Brandt for a long time. Then he shook his hand. "My grandfather didn't blame you, Mr. Brandt. He blamed the system. He said the banks and the government and the dealers all told the same lie, because they all made money from it. But the farmers were the ones who paid." Carl nodded. His eyes were red. "Your grandfather was the smartest man in this county. Most of us were too busy selling things to notice. Jesse Hadfield is 67 years old now. He still farms the 320 acres, still lives in the same farmhouse, Added 80 acres in 1991 when a neighbor retired, paid cash, no mortgage. His son Michael works alongside him. 26 years old, quiet, hard-working, drives a used pickup truck that's older than he is. The 1959 Massey Ferguson 72 is in the machine shed. Jesse can't bring himself to sell it. It hasn't run in years. The engine finally gave up for good in 1994, but it sits there, cleaned and covered, like a monument. Michael asked about it once. "Dad, why do you keep that old combine? It's just taking up space." Jesse took Michael out to the shed, pulled off the cover, showed him the welded grain tank patch, the hand-fabricated reel tines, the injection pump from Terre Haute, the bearings from Ed's coffee can. "This machine harvested 320 acres in 49 days, Jesse said. "It was 17 years old, half broken and held together with baling wire. Everyone said it was impossible. Your great-grandfather bet me the farm it couldn't be done, and then he spent the whole time secretly rooting for me to prove him wrong." He put his hand on the grain tank, feeling the rough weld under his palm. "This combine isn't taking up space, Michael. It's holding a place. There's a difference." Michael looked at his father, looked at the combine, and for the first time he understood why his family farmed the way they did, why they never borrowed, never expanded beyond what cash could buy, never chased the new and shiny when the old and paid for still worked. And somewhere in the house, in the top drawer of the desk that Ed Hadfield sat at for 50 years, was a sealed envelope that said the same thing in fewer words. Let him work, let him struggle, let him earn it. And if he earns it, give him the whole thing. Ed Hadfield was hard and quiet and afraid and wrong about some things and right about the things that mattered most. Jesse Hadfield was young and stubborn and determined and right about the only thing that counts. If you want something badly enough to suffer for it, you deserve it. And the combine, that rusted, patched, rebuilt, 17-year-old Massey Ferguson 72 that everybody laughed at, the combine was the instrument that proved them both right. Sometimes the oldest machine in the shed is the most valuable thing on the farm. Not because of what it's worth, because of what it proved.